All right, well, welcome to Logan Reads Live. Tonight for Frightful Friday, we will be completing chapter 4 of The Haunting of Hill House. But of course, Logan Reads Live is presented by Rosalind and Jane, as always. And now, as of today, the wedding collection is available for purchase on the website there. So I know that Allie, who runs the store, is very happy to have that up and going. So if you have any interest in seeing some lovely wedding dresses or wedding things there, you can go to Rosalind and Jane following the link in the description down below to see that new collection. And as has become the tradition here, I am going to start with a few poems or a couple poems before we get into the main story here, just to get past having people join late here. So we will begin. Actually, we'll probably just do one today because it's a bit of a long one. Yeah, so we're going to do The Exile's Letter by Rahaku Lipo. So I don't really research these things ahead of time. I just read them. So um, it was translated by Ezra Pound, but I don't know what language it's translated from. So we'll see how it goes here. To Sokin of Rakuyo, ancient friend, chancellor of Jen. Now I remember that you built me a special tavern by the south side of the bridge of Ten Shin. With yellow gold and white jewels we paid for songs and laughter. And we were drunk for month on month, forgetting the kings and princes. Intelligent men came drifting in from the sea and from the west border, and with them, and with you especially, there was nothing at cross purpose, and they made nothing of sea crossing or of mountain crossing, if only they could be of that fellowship. And we all spoke out our hearts and minds, and without regret. And then I was sent off to South Way, smothered in laurel groves, and you to the north of Raku Hoku, till we had nothing but thoughts and memories in common. And then, when separation had come to its worst, we met and traveled to Sengo, though all sorry, though all the 36 folds of the turning and twisting waters into a valley of 1,000 bright flowers, that was the first valley, and into 10,000 valleys full of voices and pine winds. And with silver harness and reins of gold, out came the east of Can, foreman of his company. And there came also the true man of Shi Yo to meet me, playing on a jeweled mouth organ. In the storied houses of San Ko, they gave us more Sennen music, many instruments like the sound of young phoenix broods. The foreman of Kan Chu, drunk, danced because his long sleeves wouldn't keep still with that music playing. And I, wrapped in a brocade, went to sleep with my head on his lap, and my spirit so high it was all over the heavens. And before the end of the day, we were scattered like stars or rain. I had to be off too, so far away over the waters, you back to your river bridge, and your father, who was brave as a leopard, was governor in Heishu and put down the barbarian rabble. And one May he had you send for me, despite the long distance. And what with broken wheels and so on, I won't say it wasn't hard going, over roads twisted like sheep's guts. And I was still going, late in the year, in the cutting wind from the north, and thinking how little you cared for the cost, and you caring enough to pay it. And what a reception! Red jade cups, food well set on blue jeweled table. And I was drunk, and had no thought of returning. And you would walk out with me to the western corner of the castle, to the dynastic temple with water about it clear as blue jade, with boats floating, and the sound of mouth organs and drums, with ripples like dragon scales going grass green on the water, pleasure lasting with courtesans going and coming without hindrance, with the willow flakes falling like snow, and the vermillioned girls getting drunk about sunset, and the water, 100 feet deep, reflecting green eyebrows. Eyebrows painted green are a fine sight in young moonlight, gracefully painted, and the girls singing back at each other, dancing in transparent brocade, and the wind lifting the song and interrupting it, tossing it up under the clouds, and all this comes to an end, and is not again to be met with. I went up to the court for examination, tried Lei Yu's luck, offered the Choyo song, and got no promotion, and went back to the East Mountains, white-headed. And once again later we met at the South Bridgehead, and then the crowd broke up, and you went north to San Palace. And if you ask how I regret that parting, it is like the flowers falling at spring's end, confused, whirled in a tangle. What is the use of talking? And there is no end of talking. There is no end of things in the heart. I call in the boy, have him sit on his knees here to seal this and send it 1,000 miles, thinking. That was Exile's Letter by Rihaku Lipo, translated by Ezra Pound. So, one that I don't know anything about, so I'm not going to try to illuminate that poem at all. But we will now begin with the feature presentation of Logan Reads Live, Frightful Friday, the second half of Chapter 4 of The Haunting of Hill House. Oh, I'm going to take the dust jacket off here before I start, because those are always a pain. All right. Mrs. Dudley, the doctor said, putting down his fork, an admirable souffle. Mrs. Dudley turned to regard him briefly and went into the kitchen with an empty dish. The doctor sighed and moved his shoulders tiredly. After my vigil last night, I feel the need to rest this afternoon, and you, he said to Eleanor, would do well to lie down for an hour. Perhaps a regular afternoon rest might be more comfortable for all of us. I see, said Theodora, amused. I must take an afternoon nap. It may look funny when I go home again, but I can always tell them that it was part of my schedule at Hill House. Perhaps we will have trouble sleeping at night, the doctor said, and a little chill went round the table, darkening the light of the silver and the bright colors of the china. A little cloud had drifted through the dining room and brought Mrs. Dudley after it. It's 5 minutes to 2, Mrs. Dudley said. Eleanor did not sleep during the afternoon, although she would have liked to. Instead, she lay on Theodora's bed in the green room and watched Theodora do her nails, chatting lazily, unwilling to let herself perceive that she had followed Theodora into the green room because she had not dared to go alone. I love decorating myself, Theodora said, regarding her hand affectionately. I'd like to paint myself all over. Eleanor moved comfortably. Gold paint, she suggested, hardly thinking. With her eyes almost closed, she could see Theodora only as a mass of color sitting on the floor. Nail polish and perfume and bath salts, Theodora said, as one telling the cities of the Nile, mascara. You don't think half enough of such things, Eleanor. Eleanor laughed and closed her eyes altogether. No time, she said. Well, Theodora said with determination, by the time I'm through with you, you will be a different person. I dislike being with women of no color. She laughed to show that she was teasing, and then went on, I think I will put red polish on your toes. Eleanor laughed too and held out her bare foot. After a minute, nearly asleep, she felt the odd, cold little touch of the brush on her toes and shivered. Surely a famous courtesan like yourself is accustomed to the ministrations of handmaidens, Theodora said. Your feet are dirty. Shocked, Eleanor sat up and looked. Her feet were dirty, and her nails were painted bright red. It's horrible, she said to Theodora. It's wicked, wanting to cry. Then helplessly she began to laugh at the look on Theodora's face. I'll go wash my feet, she said. Golly, Theodora said on the floor beside the bed, staring. Look, she said, my feet are dirty too, baby. Honest, look. Anyway, Eleanor said, I hate having things done to me. You're about as crazy as anyone I ever saw, Theodora said cheerfully. I don't like to feel helpless, Eleanor said. Your mother would have been delighted to see you with your toenails painted red, Theodora said. They look nice. Eleanor looked at her feet again. It's wicked, she said inadequately. I mean, on my feet. It makes me feel like I look the fool. You've got foolishness and wickedness somehow mixed up, Theodore began to gather her equipment together. Anyway, I won't take it off, and we'll both watch to see whether Luke and the doctor look at your feet first. No matter what I try to say, you make it sound foolish, Eleanor said. Or wicked. Theodora looked up at her gravely. I have a hunch, she said, that you ought to go home, Eleanor. Is she laughing at me? Eleanor wondered. Has she decided that I am not fit to stay? I don't want to go, she said. And Theodora looked at her again quickly and then away and touched Eleanor's toes softly. The polish is dry, she said. I'm an idiot. Just something frightened me for a minute. She stood up and stretched. Let's go look for the others, she said. Luke leaned himself wearily against the wall of the upstairs hall, his head resting against the gold frame of an engraving of a ruin. I keep thinking of this house as my own future property, he said, more now than I did before. I keep telling myself that it will belong to me someday, and I keep asking myself why. He gestured at the length of the hall. If I had a passion for doors, he said, or gilded clocks or miniatures, if I wanted a Turkish corner of my own, I would very likely regard Hill House as a fairyland of beauty. It's a handsome house, the doctor said staunchly. It must have been thought of as elegant when it was built. He started off down the hall. The large room on the end, which had once been a nursery. Now, he said, we shall see the tower from a window. And he shivered as he passed through the door. Then he went and looked back curiously. Could there be a draft across that doorway? A draft in Hill House? Theodora laughed. Not unless you could manage to make one of those doors stay open. Come here, one at a time, then, the doctor said, and Theodora moved forward, grimacing as she passed the doorway. Like the doorway of a tomb, she said. It's warm enough inside, though. Luke came, hesitated in the cold spot, and then moved quickly to get out of it, and Eleanor, following, felt with incredulity the piercing cold that struck her between one step and the next. It was like passing through a wall of ice, she thought, and asked the doctor, What is it? The doctor, patting his hands together with delight. You can keep your Turkish corners, my boy, he said. He reached out a hand and held it carefully over the location of the cold. They cannot explain this, he said. The very essence of a tomb, as Theodora points out, the cold spot in Borley Rectory only dropped 11 degrees, he went on complacently. This, I should think, is considerably colder, the heart of the house. Theodora and Eleanor had moved to stand close together. Although the nursery was warm, it smelled musty and close, and the cold crossing the doorway was almost tangible, visible as a barrier which must be crossed in order to get out. Beyond the windows, the gray stone of the tower pressed close. Inside, the room was dark, and the line of nursery animals painted along the wall seemed somehow not at all jolly, but as though they were trapped, or related to the dying deer in the sporting prints of the game room. The nursery, larger than the other bedrooms, had an indefinable air of neglect found nowhere else in Hill House, and it crossed Eleanor's mind that even Mrs. Dudley's diligent care might not bring her across that cold barrier any oftener than necessary. Luke had stepped back across the cold spot and was examining the hall carpet, then the walls, patting at the surfaces as though hoping to discover some cause for the odd cold. It couldn't be a draft, he said, looking up at the doctor, unless they've got a direct airline to the North Pole. Everything's solid anyway. I wonder who slept in the nursery, the doctor said irreverently. Do you suppose they shut it up once all the children were gone? Look, Luke said, pointing. In either corner of the hall, over the nursery doorway, two grinning heads were set, meant apparently as gay decorations for the nursery entrance. They were no more jolly or carefree than the animals inside. Their separate stares, captured forever in distorted laughter, met and locked at the point of the hall where the vicious cold entered. When you stand where they can look at you, Luke explained, they freeze you. Curiously, the doctor stepped down the hall to join him, looking up. Don't leave us alone in here, Theodora said, and ran out of the nursery, pulling Eleanor through the cold, which was like a fast slap or a close, cold breath. A fine place to chill our beer, she said, and put out her tongue at the grinning faces. I must make a full account of this, the doctor said, happily. It doesn't seem like an impartial cold, Eleanor said, awkward because she was not quite sure what she meant. I felt it was as deliberate as though something wanted to give me an unpleasant shock. It is because of the faces, I suppose, the doctor said. He was on his hands and knees, feeling along the floor. Measuring tape and thermometer, he told himself. Chalk for an outline. Perhaps the cold intensifies at night. Everything is worse, he said, looking at Eleanor. If you think something is looking at you. Luke stepped through the cold with a shiver and closed the door to the nursery. He came back to the others in the hall with a kind of leap, as though he thought he could escape the cold by not touching the floor. With the nursery door closed, they realized all at once how much darker it had become, and Theodora said restlessly, Let's get downstairs to our parlor. I can feel those hills pushing in. After 5, Luke said. Cocktail time, I suppose, he said to the doctor. You will trust me to mix you a cocktail again tonight? Too much vermouth, the doctor said, and followed him lingeringly, watching the nursery door over his shoulder. I propose, the doctor said, setting down his napkin, that we take our coffee in our little parlor. I find that the fire is very cheerful. Theodore giggled. Mrs. Dudley's gone, so let's race around fast and get all those doors and windows open and take everything down from the shelves. The house seems different when she's not in it, Eleanor said. Emptier. Luke looked at her and nodded as he was arranging the coffee cups on a tray, and the doctor had already gone on, doggedly opening doors and propping them. Each night I realize suddenly that we 4 are alone here. Although Mrs. Dudley's not much good as far as company is concerned, it's funny, Eleanor said, looking down at the dinner table. I dislike Mrs. Dudley as much as any of you, but my mother would never let me get up and leave a table looking like this until morning. If she wants to leave before dark, she has to clear away in the morning, Theodore said without interest. I'm certainly not going to do it. It's not nice to walk away and leave a dirty table. You couldn't get them back on the right shelves anyway, and she'd have to do it all over again just to get your finger marks off things. If I just took the silverware and let it soak. No, Theodora said, catching her hand. Do you want to go out into that kitchen all alone with all those doors? No, Eleanor said, setting down a handful of forks she had gathered. I guess I don't, really. She lingered to look uneasily at the table, at the crumpled napkins and the drop of wine spilled by Luke's place, and shook her head. I don't know what my mother would say, though. Come on, Theodora said. They have left lights for us. The fire in the little parlor was bright, and Theodora sat down beside the coffee tray while Luke brought brandy from the cupboard, where he had carefully set it away the night before. We must be cheerful at all costs, he said. I'll challenge you again tonight, Doctor. Before dinner, they had ransacked the other downstairs rooms for comfortable chairs and lamps, and now their little parlor was easily the pleasantest room in the house. Hill House has really been very kind to us, Theodore said, giving Eleanor her coffee, and Eleanor sat down gratefully in a pillowy, overstuffed chair. No dirty dishes for Eleanor to wash, a pleasant evening in good company, and perhaps the sun shining again tomorrow. We must plan our picnic, Eleanor said. I'm going to get fat and lazy in Hill House, Theodora went on. Her insistence on naming Hill House troubled Eleanor. It's as though she were saying it deliberately. Eleanor thought, telling the house she knows its name, calling the house to tell it where we are. Is it bravado? Hill House, Hill House, Hill House, Theodora said softly and smiled across at Eleanor. Tell me, Luke said politely to Theodora, since you are a princess, tell me about the political situation in your country. Very unsettled, Theodora said. I ran away because my father, who is, of course, the king, insists that I marry Black Michael, who is the pretender to the throne. I, of course, cannot endure the sight of Black Michael, who wears one gold earring and beats his grooms with a riding crop. a most unstable country, Luke said. How did you ever manage to get away? I fled in a hay wagon, disguised as a milkmaid. They never thought to look for me there, and I crossed the border with papers I forged myself in a woodcutter's hut. And Black Michael will no doubt take over the country now in a coup d'etat. Undoubtedly, and he can have it. It's like waiting in a dentist's office, Eleanor thought, watching them over her coffee cup. Waiting in a dentist's office and listening to other patients make brave jokes across the room, all of you certain to meet the dentist sooner or later. She looked up suddenly, aware of the doctor near her, and smiled uncertainly. Nervous? The doctor asked, and Eleanor nodded. Only because I wonder what's going to happen, she said. So do I. The doctor moved a chair and sat down beside her. You have the feeling that something, whatever it is going to happen soon. Yes, everything seems to be waiting. And they, the doctor nodded at Theodora and Luke, who were laughing at each other, they meet it in their way. I wonder what it will do to all of us. I would have said a month ago that a situation like this would never really come about, that we four would sit here together in this house. He does not name it, Eleanor noticed. I've been waiting for a long time, he said. You think we are right to stay, right? He said. I think we are all incredibly silly to stay. I think that an atmosphere like this one can find out the flaws and faults and weaknesses in all of us and break us apart in a matter of days. We have only one defense, and that is running away. At least it can't follow us, can it? When we feel ourselves endangered, we can leave, just as we came, and, he added dryly, just as fast as we can go. But we were forewarned, Eleanor said, and there are four of us together. I have already mentioned this to Luke and Theodora, he said. Promise me absolutely that you will leave as fast as you can if you begin to feel that the house is catching at you. I promise, Eleanor said, smiling. He was trying to make me feel braver, she thought, and was grateful. It's all right, though, she told him. Really, it's all right. I will feel no hesitation about sending you away, he said, rising. It seems to be necessary, or if it seems to be necessary. Luke, he said, will the ladies excuse us? While they set up the chessboard, and men, Theodora wandered. Sorry. I see what I did. While they set up the chessboard and men, Theodora wandered, cup in hand, around the room, and Eleanor thought, she moves like an animal, nervous and alert. She can't sit still, while there are any scent of disturbance in the air. We are all uneasy. Come and sit by me, she said, and Theodora came, moving with grace, circling to a resting spot. She sat down in the chair the doctor had left and leaned her head back tiredly. How lovely she is, Eleanor thought. How thoughtlessly, luckily lovely. Are you tired? Theodora turned her head, smiling. I can't stand waiting much longer. I was just thinking how relaxed you looked. And I was just thinking of, when was it? The day before yesterday? And wondering how I could have brought myself to leave there and come here. Possibly I'm homesick. Already? Did you ever think about being homesick? If your home was Hill House, would you be homesick for it? Did those two little girls cry for their dark, grim house when they were taken away? I've never been away from anywhere, Eleanor said carefully, so I suppose I've never been homesick. How about now, your little apartment? Perhaps, Eleanor said, looking into the fire. I haven't had it long enough to believe it's my own. I want my own bed, Theodore said. And Eleanor thought, she is sulking again, and when she is hungry or tired or bored, she turned into a baby. I'm sleepy, Theodora said. It's after 11, Eleanor said, as she turned to glance at the chess game. The doctor shouted with joyful triumph, and Luke laughed. Now, sir, the doctor said. Now, sir. Fairly beaten, I admit, Luke said. He began to gather the chessmen and set them back into their box. Any reason why I can't take a drop of brandy upstairs with me? To put myself to sleep, or give me myself Dutch courage, or some such reason, actually. And he smiled over at Theodora and Eleanor. I plan to stay up and read for a while. Are you still reading Pamela? Eleanor asked the doctor. Volume 2. I have 3 volumes to go, and then I shall begin Clarissa Harlowe, I think. Perhaps Luke would care to borrow. No, thanks, Luke said hastily. I have a suitcase full of mystery stories. The doctor turned to look around. Let me see, he said. Fire screened, lights out, leave the doors for Mrs. Dudley to close in the morning. Tiredly, following one another, they went up the great stairway, turning out lights behind them. Has everyone got a flashlight, by the way? The doctor asked, and they nodded, more intent upon sleep than the waves of darkness which came after them up the stairs of Hill House. Good night, everyone, Eleanor said, opening the door to the blue room. Good night, Luke said. Good night, Theodora said. Good night, the doctor said. Sleep tight. Coming, mother, coming, Eleanor said, fumbling for the light. It's all right, I'm coming. Eleanor, she heard. Eleanor. Coming, coming, she out shouted irritably. Just a minute, I'm coming. Eleanor? Then she thought, with a crashing shock which brought her awake, cold and shivering, out of bed and awake. I am in Hill House. What? She cried out. What, Theodora? Eleanor, in here. Coming. No time for the light. She kicked a table out of the way, wondering at the noise of it, and struggling briefly with the door of the connecting bathroom. That is not the table falling, she thought. My mother is knocking on the wall. It was blessedly light in Theodora's room, and Theodora was sitting up in bed, her hair tangled from sleep and her eyes wide with the shock of awakening. I must look the same way, Eleanor thought, and said, I am here. What is it? And then heard clearly for the first time, although she had been hearing it ever since she awakened. What is it? She whispered. She sat slowly on the foot of Theodora's bed, wondering at what seemed calmness in herself. Now, she thought, now. It is only a noise, and terribly cold. Terribly, terribly cold. It is a noise down the hall, far down at the end, near the nursery door. And terribly cold, not my mother knocking on the wall. Something is knocking on the doors, Theodora said in a tone of pure rationality. That's all, and it's down near the other end of the hall. Luke and the doctor are probably there already to see what is going on. Not at all like my mother knocking on the wall. I was dreaming again. Bang, bang, Theodora said. Bang, Eleanor said and giggled. I am calm, she thought, but so very cold. The noise is only a kind of banging on the doors, one after another. Is this what I was so afraid about? Bang is the best word for it. It sounds like something children do, not mothers knocking against the wall for help. And anyway, Luke and the doctor are there. Is this what they mean by cold chills going up and down your back? Because it is not pleasant. It starts in your stomach and goes in waves around and up and down again like something alive. Like something alive. Yes, like something alive. Theodora, she said, and closed her eyes and tightened her teeth together and wrapped her arms around herself. It's getting closer. Just a noise, Theodora said, and moved next to Eleanor and sat tight against her. It has an echo. It sounded, Eleanor thought, like a hollow noise, a hollow bang, as though something were hitting the doors with an iron kettle, or an iron bar, or an iron glove. It pounded regularly for a minute, and then suddenly more softly, and then again in a quick flurry, seeming to be going methodically from door to door at the end of the hall. Distantly, she thought, she could hear the voices of Luke and the doctor calling from somewhere below, and she thought, then they are not up here with us at all, and heard the iron clashing against what must have been a door very close. Maybe it will go down on the other side of the hall, Theodora whispered, and Eleanor thought that the oddest part of this indescribable experience was that Theodora should be having it too. No, Theodora said, and they heard the crash against the door across the hall. It was louder. It was deafening. It struck against the door next to them. Did it move back and forth across the hall? Did it go on feet along the carpet? Did it lift a hand to the door? And Eleanor threw herself away from the bed and ran to hold her hands against the door. Go away, she shouted wildly. Go away, go away. There was complete silence, and Eleanor thought, standing with her face against the door, now I've done it. It was looking for the room with someone inside. The cold crept and pinched at them, filling and overflowing the room. Anyone would have thought that the inhabitants of Hill House slept sweetly in this quiet. And then, so suddenly that Eleanor wheeled around, the sound of Theodore's teeth chattering, and Eleanor laughed. "You big baby," she said. "I'm cold," Theodora said. "Deadly cold." "So am I." Eleanor took the green quilt and threw it around Theodora and took up Theodora's warm dressing gown and put it on. "You warmer now?" "Where's Luke? Where's the doctor?" "I don't know. Are you warmer now?" "No." Theodora shivered. "In a minute I'll go out in the hall and call them. Are you—" It started again, as though it had been listening, waiting to hear their voices and what they said, to identify them, to know how well prepared they were against it, waiting to hear if they were afraid, so suddenly that Eleanor leapt back against the bed, and Theodora gasped and cried out. An iron crash came against their door, and both of them lifted their eyes in horror, because the hammering was against the upper edge of the door, higher than either of them could reach, higher than Luke or the doctor could reach, and the sickening, degrading cold came in waves from whatever was outside the door. Eleanor stood perfectly still and looked at the door. She did not quite know what to do, although she believed that she was thinking coherently and was not unusually frightened, not more frightened, certainly, than she had believed in her worst dreams she could be. The cold troubled her even more than the sounds. Even Theodora's warm robe was useless against the icy little curls of fingers on her back. The intelligent thing to do, perhaps, was to walk over and open the door. That, perhaps, would belong to the doctor's views of pure scientific inquiry. Eleanor knew that, even if her feet would take her as far as the door, her hand would not lift the doorknob. Impartially, remotely, she told herself that no one's hand would touch that knob. It's not the work of hands, it's not the work hands were made for, she told herself. She had been rocking a little, each crash against the door pushing her a little backward, and now she was still because the noise was fading. "I'm going to complain to the janitor about the radiators," Theodora said from behind her. "Is it stopping?" "No," Eleanor said, sick. "No." It had found them. Since Eleanor would not open the door, it was going to make its own way in. Eleanor said aloud, "Now I know why people scream, because I think I'm going to." And Theodora said, "I will if you will," and laughed, so that Eleanor turned quickly back to the bed and they held each other, listening in silence. Little pattings came from round the doorframe, small, seeking sounds, feeling the edges of the door, trying to sneak a way in. The doorknob was fondled, and Eleanor, whispering, asked, "Is it locked?" And Theodora nodded, and then, wide-eyed, turned to stare at the connecting bathroom door. "Mine's locked too," Eleanor said against her ear, and Theodora closed her eyes in relief. The little sticky sounds moved on around the doorframe, and then, as though a fury caught whatever was outside, the crashing came again, and Eleanor and Theodora saw the wood of the door tremble and shake, and the door moved against its hinges. "You can't get in," Eleanor said wildly, and again there was a silence, as though the house listened with attention to her words, understanding, cynically agreeing, content to wait. A thin little giggle came in a breath of air through the room, a little mad rising laugh, the smallest whisper of a laugh, and Eleanor heard it all up and down her back. A little gloating laugh moving past them around the house, and then she heard the doctor and Luke calling from the stairs, and mercifully it was over. When the real silence came, Eleanor breathed shakily and moved stiffly. "We have been clutching each other like a couple of lost children," Theodora said, and untwined her arms from around Eleanor's neck. "You're wearing my bathrobe." "I forgot mine. Is it really over?" "For tonight, anyway," Theodora spoke with certainty. "Can't you tell? Aren't you warm again?" The sickening cold was gone, except for a reminiscent little thrill of it down Eleanor's back when she looked at the door. She began to pull at the tight knot she had put in the bathroom cord and said, "Intense cold is one of the symptoms of shock." "Intense shock is one of the symptoms I've got," Theodora said. "Here come Luke and the doctor." Their voices were outside in the hall, speaking quickly, anxiously, and Eleanor dropped Theodore's robe on the bed and said, "For heaven's sake, don't let them knock on that door. One more knock would finish me," and ran into her own room to get her own robe. Behind her, she could hear Theodora telling them to wait a minute, and then going to unlock the door, and then Luke's voice pleasantly saying to Theodora, "Why, you look as though you'd seen a ghost." And Eleanor came back. She noticed that both Luke and the doctor were dressed, and it occurred to her that it might be a sound idea from now on. If that intense cold was going to come back at night, it was going to find Eleanor sleeping in a wool suit and a heavy sweater, and she didn't care what Mrs. Dudley was going to say when she found that at least one of the lady guests was lying in one of the clean beds, in heavy shoes and wool socks. "Well," she asked, "how do you gentlemen like living in a haunted house?" "It's perfectly fine," Luke said. "Perfectly fine. It gives me an excuse to have a drink in the middle of the night." He had the brandy bottle and glasses, and Eleanor thought that they must make a companionable little group, the four of them sitting around Theodore's room at 4 in the morning drinking brandy. They spoke lightly, quickly, and gave one another fast, hidden, little curious glances, each of them wondering what secret terror had been tapped in the others, what changes might show in face or gesture, what unguarded weakness might have opened the way to ruin. "Did anything happen in here while we were outside?" the doctor asked. Eleanor and Theodora looked at each other and laughed. Honestly, at last, without any edge of hysteria or fear. After a minute, Theodora said carefully, "Nothing in particular. Someone knocked on the door with a cannonball and then tried to get in and eat us, and started laughing its head off when we wouldn't open the door, but nothing really out of the way." Curiously, Eleanor went over and opened the door. "I thought the whole door was going to shatter," she said, bewildered. "And there isn't even a scratch on the wood, nor any of the other doors. They're perfectly smooth." "How nice that it didn't mar the woodwork," Theodora said, holding her brandy glass out to Luke. "I couldn't bear it if this dear old house got hurt." She grinned at Eleanor. "Nellie here was going to scream." "So were you." "Not at all. I only said so to keep you company. Besides, Mrs. Dudley already said she wouldn't come. And where were you, our manly defenders?" "We were chasing a dog," Luke said. "At least some animal like a dog." He stopped and then went on reluctantly. "We followed it outside." Theodora stared, and Eleanor said, "You mean it was inside?" "I saw it ran past my door," the doctor said. "Just caught a glimpse of it, slipping along. I woke Luke, and we followed it down the stairs and out into the garden and lost it somewhere back of the house." "The front door was open." "No," Luke said. "The front door was closed. So were all the other doors. We checked." "We've been wandering around for quite a while," the doctor said. "We never dreamed that you ladies were awake until we heard your voices." He spoke gravely. "There is one thing we have not taken into account," he said. They looked at him, puzzled, and he explained, checking on his fingers in his lecture style. "First," he said, "Luke and I were awakened earlier than you ladies, clearly. We have been up and about, outside and in, for better than 2 hours. Led on what you, perhaps, might allow me to call a wild goose chase. Second, neither of us," he glanced inquiringly at Luke as he spoke, "heard any sound up here until your voices began. It was perfectly quiet. That is, the sound which hammered on your door was not audible to us. When we gave up our vigil and decided to come upstairs, we apparently drove away whatever was waiting outside your door. Now, as we sit here together, all is quiet." "I still don't see what you mean," Theodora said, frowning. "We must take precautions," he said. "Against what? How?" "When Luke and I are called outside, and you two are kept imprisoned inside, doesn't it begin to seem," and his voice was very quiet, "doesn't it begin to seem that the intention is, somehow, to separate us?" And that concludes chapter 4 of The Haunting of Hill House, where it seems the haunting truly has begun in earnest now. Anyways, thank you very much for watching and listening to Logan Reads Live Frightful Friday, where we read the second half of The Haunting of Hill House. As always, of course, Logan Reads Live is presented by Rosalind and Jane. There is a link in the description where you can go and see the new wedding collection, which is live now on the store. Anyways, thank you very much. Have a good night and a good weekend. Goodbye for now.